Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to our weekly podcast, Palestine This Week, with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, as always, it's a pleasure to see you again.
Likewise, Nassim, and it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, so this week, Mouin, let's begin with a statement by Hamas. We'll focus on Hamas quite a bit this week, specifically related to its position on the two-state solution. And then we'll discuss the countries that have issued statements saying that they will recognize a Palestinian state. So I want to take an historical look at that. Have Palestinians always rejected a two-state solution or the offers that they have been presented throughout history? So I want to, take a look at that and then move on to some of the other broader issues. But let's begin, as I said, with Hamas, who issued a statement last week saying that it will not disarm unless an independent Palestinian state is established with Jerusalem as its capital. So this came within the context of a number of Arab countries and Western states saying that they want Hamas to surrender and give up control of the Gaza Strip. And also Witkoff more directly saying that he had a response from Hamas saying that it had agreed to disarm. So just your thoughts on that. How should
Yeah,
we view this story? Because it seems there is
yeah,
a contradictory statement here.
yes.
And will Hamas disarm without anything in return? It does, if Hamas's statement is true that it will only disarm within the context of a two-state solution, it does seem to reflect Israel's weakness and inability to defeat Hamas because Hamas is making conditions on its surrender or giving up
Yeah.
arms.
Yeah. Well, those are actually two, arguably three separate issues that are the result of two different meetings. You had the meeting in New York held at the United Nations, organized by France and Saudi Arabia recently, in which the final communique of that meeting, that was endorsed by a fairly large number of states, um, called upon governance in the Gaza Strip that excluded Hamas. And that's actually an issue that's been resolved for a long time because there's already an agreement between Fatah and Hamas. It was initiated in Beijing, Chinese capital, last year, and then confirmed in a agreement signed by the two movements in Cairo that post-war governance, if I can use that term, in the Gaza Strip would be independent of both Hamas and Fatah. And I think part of this is that Hamas simply doesn't want to bear responsibility for dealing with the massive, arguably insurmountable challenge of reconstruction in the Gaza Strip. And the other part of it, of course, is that Hamas also recognizes that so long as it remains directly involved in governance and administration, those with the largest capability to support reconstruction in the Gaza Strip aren't going to commit a single penny to doing so. So that's the issue of governance and administration, and Hamas has already agreed not to directly participate in that. What it does insist upon is that any governance structure that is established in the Gaza Strip that excludes Hamas is to be approved by Hamas. In other words, it's calling for consultation and consent rather than participation or hegemony as it's exercised since 2007. So that's not really a significant issue, except that on the other side of the Palestinian equation, you have a Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas, who has essentially overruled the agreement reached by the Fatah negotiator in the sense that he doesn't want to be part of any agreement that has been concluded with Hamas, even if that agreement includes a commitment by Hamas not to be involved in governance and administration. Then there's the You could argue it's related, but I tend to view it primarily as a separate issue of Hamas's arms, of its weaponry. And here is there was a meeting between the U.S. envoy, Steve Witkoff, and families of the Israeli captives who remain in the Gaza Strip, in which Witkoff claimed that he had a commitment from Hamas to disarm in the context of an agreement that would end Israel's genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip. And Hamas almost immediately responded that it had made no such commitment and would make no such commitment because these weapons, according to Hamas, are to ensure that it can fight for an end to occupation, and therefore calling for the disarmament of Hamas without taking any measures to end the occupation. Quite the contrary, taking various initiatives and policies that deepen the occupation is, according to Hamas, putting the cart before the horse. And so Hamas's position remains that it will only surrender its weapons in the context of an end to the occupation and the establishment of an independent Palestinian state in the territories occupied in 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital. And what it has said is at that stage it will surrender all its weapons to the new state. Its fighters will either join the Palestinian security forces or be demobilized, kind of thing we've seen at the conclusion of other anti colonial struggles. But the point here is that Witkoff appears to have either misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented Hamas's position, and Hamas clarified that it has absolutely no intention of surrendering its arms so long as the occupation persists.
Mm. What then is Hamas's position regarding the two-state? I mean, I want to focus on this issue in
Mhm.
this segment because we know Netanyahu has said on a number of occasions that he obstructed the two-state solution. He's opposed to this two-state solution, and it's no secret that he's tried to sabotage and undermine the creation of a Palestinian state. And he's not alone; many other Israeli leaders have done that. And Hamas is always presented as the thorn on the creation of on the two-state solution, that they're the rejectionists and they're the ones who have strongly opposed. We know Hamas has gone through many evolutions, but what is its current position with regards to the two-state solution?
Well, I would argue that even if it were correct to say that Hamas, as a matter of principle, always has and always will reject a two-state settlement, that would still not be a legitimate pretext for Israel to refuse to end the occupation or to negotiate arrangements for the establishment of an independent and sovereign Palestinian state. If you look at the period before last year's International Court of Justice advisory opinion that ruled that the occupation is illegal and effectively must end unconditionally, therefore not subject to negotiations, Israel was negotiating with the PLO. And the PLO, of course, is on record for decades endorsing a two-state settlement, has taken initiatives to this, has recognized Israel, has even recognized Israel's so-called right to exist. And it would hardly be the first situation where, a colonial power reaches a negotiated settlement with the chief representative of the colonized, and then you have other movements within the colonized population that reject such an agreement. I mean, you can think of Ireland. You can think of other places where that's been the case. But getting back to your question, Hamas, of course, was established in the late 1980s, not only in the context of the so-called First Intifada, the 1987-1993 popular uprising in the occupied territories, but was also established at a time when the chief representative of the Palestinians, the organization that is recognized by the international community as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians, the PLO, had taken a decisive turn towards endorsement of a two-state settlement. It began doing so in the 1970s, but this was formalized during the 1980s, and particularly in the context of its 15 November 1988 declaration of independence, and then put into effect, if you will, in the context of the 1993 Oslo Accords, where it formally recognized Israel and so on. So Hamas, in its origin, was established in significant part in opposition to this, and maintained that its program called for the not only the total liberation of Palestine, meaning the entire territory of the British Mandate of Palestine, including Israel and the occupied territories, but also transforming that entire territory into not just a Palestinian state, but an Islamic state. That was its initial position in the late 1980s. And of course, people always refer to the Hamas charter that was promulgated also in 1988. Yes, the Hamas charter contains a lot of nasty things. Um, and that should be, of course, recognized and neither dismissed nor minimized. But one also, has to question to what extent Hamas, or for that matter, any other political movement or state, goes and consults its founding document every time it has to make a political decision. So, having said that, Hamas, virtually from the outset, in discussions, for example, between the former Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Hamas founders Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and Mahmoud Zahar, who were in Israeli prisons, and other statements and interviews, began to allude to its willingness to accept a what it called a long-term hudna, which is basically an indefinite ceasefire lasting decades in exchange for a full Israeli withdrawal from the territories occupied in 1967 and the establishment in those territories of an independent and sovereign Palestinian state, and a just resolution of the refugee question, which Hamas, of course, interpreted in line with relevant international resolutions and practices of implementing the Palestinian right of return for those refugees who do want to return to their original homes. And this was kind of, bearing in mind that Hamas is an Islamic movement. This was its way of effectively endorsing a two-state settlement without renouncing its preferred objective of the liberation of all of Palestine. And then we began to see in the 2000s, um, even in the late 90s, if I'm not mistaken, that Hamas's position began to change again, in which it said, this is our position. We believe in establishing a free and independent Palestinian state in all of Palestine. Having said that, if the PLO is able to negotiate an agreement for an independent Palestinian state in the territories occupied in 1967, in other words, if the PLO successfully negotiates a two-state settlement with Israel, and if that peace treaty is endorsed either by the Palestinian people in a referendum or by legitimate Palestinian national institutions, by which it meant a PLO that would incorporate rather than exclude Hamas, then Hamas would, in practice, accept that agreement and would not work to undermine or sabotage it. In other words, Hamas was more or less openly endorsing a two-state settlement. And people have said that this was actually a fairly cynical approach by Hamas, basically saying, we're pure, we believe in the total liberation of Palestine, but if others want to dirty their hands and accept only the part of it that was occupied in 1967, we will accept that because we're not going to be the ones dirtying our hands. But there's also a more substantial issue here, is that peace treaties and recognition and so on are acts that are conducted by states or at least by national representatives. So you go back to the Oslo Agreement, the recognition of Israel was conducted not by the Fatah movement or any other organization that operates within the framework of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. No, that was conducted by the PLO, by the national leadership. So Hamas's position that on the one hand, it will never recognize Israel, but on the other hand, is prepared to coexist with a two-state settlement, is not really different from similar situations, including that of its chief rival, the Fatah movement, which on the one hand accepted the Oslo Agreement, became the backbone of the Palestinian Authority, but it was only the PLO that recognized Israel. Then in I believe it was in 2017,
17.
Hamas issued a new political program. And this essentially overrode the 1988 charter. 1988 charter was a very lengthy document with all kinds of nonsense in it that was basically Hamas's initial calling card to the Palestinian people. It included all kinds of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about how, the Jews were responsible for World War I and World War II and other nonsense. But the 2017 document was not a charter, it was a political program. In other words, these are our objectives. And it was quite explicit that Hamas's objective was to achieve an independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, with East Jerusalem as its capital, and a resolution of the refugee question. And in the meantime, of course, Hamas had signed on to a whole number of agreements with other Palestinian factions, including the 2006 so-called prisoners document and others, which explicitly identified a two-state settlement as the national objective of the Palestinian national movement. Now, of course, you can make the argument, that Israel never seriously engaged with these Palestinian intentions, and that they have been completely overtaken by events, and that it's therefore now become primarily irrelevant and purely of historic interest. But having said that, I do think it's also important to be clear and to be accurate about where Hamas, and for that matter, other Palestinians have stood on this issue, because, of course, Israel always likes to present it as a situation where Israel has, from the outset, supported an end to the occupation and the establishment of a Palestinian state. But it is the Palestinians who have consistently rejected that, because they seek the destruction of Israel and throwing the Jews into the sea and things of that sort. Well, the historical record is, of course, very different. And if I could just make one point, Israel and its apologists always like to ask, well, if it's not about the establishment of a Palestinian state in the occupied territories, why wasn't a Palestinian state established in these exact same territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, between 1948 and 1967? Well, there's a very clear reason for that. On the one hand, Israel and the Hashemite monarch in Jordan, King Abdullah I, had been negotiating since the 1930s to partition Palestine between them, and precisely to prevent the establishment of an independent Arab state west of the Jordan River. In other words, undermining the possibility of the establishment of a Palestinian state was official Zionist policy even before the Israeli state was established in 1948. The Gaza Strip was somewhat different. The West Bank, of course, was annexed by Jordan after 1948. That recognition was formally recognized only by Britain and Pakistan. No other country in the world recognized it. And then in the Gaza Strip, bearing in mind, that here we're talking about literally 1% of the territory of mandatory Palestine, rather than being annexed by Egypt, it came under Egyptian administration. Egypt governed that area, at least formally, as an integral component of Palestine rather than as part of Egypt. And I think it's entirely reasonable under these circumstances to understand that the Palestinians felt that had they established an independent Palestinian state in the Gaza Strip in 1948, it would have lasted about 18 minutes before that too would have been overrun by Israel and annexed to the new Israeli state, just as Israel seized and annexed huge amounts of Palestinian territory beyond the borders of the 1947 partition resolution during the Palestine War.
So it seems from what you're saying that if you scratch beneath Israel's propaganda, the Hamas's position really isn't that much different to the Arab 2002 initiative. All the Arab countries have agreed to a two-state settlement with Israel ending its occupation and recognizing Palestinian state. And if Israel did that, then it would normalize relationship with Israel. So the idea that Israel is surrounded by enemies is a choice by Israel, because Israel does not accept the existence of a Palestinian state, even though that's on the table. It has been on the table for many, many decades, and even Hamas is on board a two-state settlement, from what you're saying. Same as Iran. Iran is on board with a two-state settlement, and should Israel choose that, then all the regional countries would normalize ties with Israel.
Well,
And it's Israel's choice which is continuing this ethnic cleansing and this genocide, because ultimately one could say that it's Netanyahu and his far-right extremists who want to take over all of historic Palestine and prevent the creation of a Palestinian state.
Well, precisely, and I'm glad you mentioned the Arab Peace Initiative. Um, uh, this was as you mentioned, the diplomatic initiative unveiled first by the Saudi crown prince at the time, and later King Abdullah, largely in response to the severe criticism of Saudi Arabia in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, in which 15 of the 19 terrorists were Saudis, and he was trying, to show some flexibility, let's say, towards the United States, and it seems chose to do so at the expense of the Palestinians. But that that initiative was then endorsed by the Arab League. Hamas is not a member of the Arab League. The PLO is a member of the Arab League, and the PLO accepted the Arab Peace Initiative, and it was then endorsed by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which includes 57 states, including Iran. And Iran accepted the Arab Peace Initiative in the context of a resolution to that effect by the OIC. I'm not sure if Hamas ever formally endorsed the Arab Peace Initiative. I would have to go back and check, but I do know that they were making a large number of very positive noises about it, to the effect that, well, if this is actually implemented, we will accept it. Israel's response was, of course, very different. It was immediate and outright rejection in 2002, and ever since. Israel has never accepted either the Arab Peace Initiative or the initiative as a basis for a resolution of the question of Palestine and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, what is Israel's position on a Palestinian state? As I pointed out, it actively colluded with Jordan during the 1940s to prevent the establishment of such a state. There is some evidence that in the immediate aftermath of the June 1967 war, that there were senior figures in, I believe, in Israeli military intelligence who proposed that Israel sponsor the establishment of a Palestinian state in parts of the West Bank and share it with Jordan, basically in order to stave off eventual international pressure to withdraw from the newly occupied territories. To the best of my recollection, that proposal was never endorsed by the Israeli government. And then to get to an Israeli acceptance of a Palestinian state, you have to fast forward all the way to 2000. People often forget that Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli signatory to the Oslo agreements in 1993, went to his grave in 1995 after being assassinated by an Israeli extremist, never having accepted the establishment of a Palestinian state. It was either him or another Israeli leader saying, that at the conclusion of this process, the Palestinians will have an entity that will basically be under the full control of Israel, in effect, a protectorate. And if they want to call it a Bantustan, a state, or an empire, that's for the Palestinians to decide. Now, during the first decade of the 2000s, there were a number of negotiations and, in some respects, even agreements between Israelis and Palestinians in which Israeli leaders did endorse the principle of a Palestinian state, even a Palestinian state in most of the territories that Israel had occupied in 1967. The problem with that is that the key issue, of course, has always been whether or not Israel would relinquish the territories it occupied in 1967, and only then whether a Palestinian state would be established in these territories. And consistently, Israel insisted on maintaining not only a significant proportion of territory, but also in key strategic locations that, in addition to allowing Israel to maintain the bulk of its settlements and illegal settlements and settlers in the occupied territories, would also fragment the prospective Palestinian state. And it proposed to compensate the Palestinians for this by giving them some sandy area on the border of Rafah in the Gaza Strip. So yes, Israel has accepted or has at certain points during the first decade of this century accepted the establishment of a Palestinian state, but not one that would fully replace the illegal occupation.
And I think further confirmation of what we're saying, which is that Israel will never accept a Palestinian state, is the fallout from the recognition or the announcement to recognize a Palestinian state by the US, France, and a number of other European countries. There's been a lot of pushback against that, and I want to get your thoughts on that. There's been two arguments that has been made. One is that, what is the point of this announcement? There are many other things which the UK in particular can do, for example, before making this symbolic gesture to recognize a Palestinian state. It could, for example, end arms sales, sanction Israeli leaders, help or give support and assistance to international organizations like the ICC, which is coming under more and more attack by Israel and the US. US, of course, has placed sanctions on the ICC. And the other argument that's been presented is that this is somehow rewarding Hamas, rewarding terrorism, which is kind of an odd argument to make, because it was the UK, you can argue, who initially rewarded Zionist terrorism by granting uh, early Zionists a state of their own in historic Palestine. So that in itself is rewarding terrorism. And you can say the West has always rewarded Israel for its, despite its impunity, occupation, expansion of settlements. So the rewarding of illegal behavior is something which the West has been doing for a long, long time. So just get your thoughts on those 2 points, the idea that somehow this is just symbolic. This doesn't really do much. UK, if it was really serious, it could have done more other than to offer this symbolic gesture. And also this idea of rewarding terrorism, knowing full well that, early Zionists were themselves regarded by the MI6, MI5, British intelligence as the biggest threat to British interest in the Middle East.
Yeah. If I can just make one more point regarding our previous discussion before responding to your question, because many people will respond and say, well, didn't Ehud Olmert offer Mahmoud Abbas a state in 2008? And didn't Ehud Barak offer the Palestinians a state in 2001? And didn't Bill Clinton offer the Palestinians a state in Camp David and in 2000? I'm going to ignore Camp David for a moment because there was never a comprehensive offer that the Palestinians rejected, and Clinton's claims to that effect can be easily dismissed with reference to the documentary record. Clinton then published the Clinton parameters in December of 2000, and what happened here is that both the Israelis and the Palestinians accepted these parameters with reservations, and then the clock ran out and there were no further negotiations. But those then went to Taba, where the Palestinian and Israeli delegations had actually reached a agreement that was very close to a comprehensive two-state settlement, but it was the Israeli prime minister at the time fighting for his political survival, Ehud Barak, who withdrew the Israeli delegation from those negotiations. So that's not really a persuasive response to my earlier point. And then in 2008, um, Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas were negotiating, and Olmert did in fact make a what he believed to be a serious proposal to Mahmoud Abbas, and Abbas never accepted it. And the reason for that is quite simple. It was already clear that the Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, was on his way to prison, and that whoever succeeded him would seek to reinvent the wheel. In other words, Abbas felt quite rightly that if he accepted this proposal, not only would it not be implemented, but given that it already didn't give the Palestinians everything they wanted and were entitled to under international law, that would be used as a base to whittle down still further. And interestingly, even Olmert's foreign minister at the time, Tzipi Livni, went to the Palestinians and told them, don't accept this proposal. Olmert won't be able to implement it. So I just wanted to make those minor clarifications for skeptics. Now, regarding recognition, I do think that recognition is primarily a symbolic gesture, but I also don't think that symbolic gestures are by definition meaningless. And the recognition of Palestinian statehood, particularly by members of the United Nations Security Council like Britain and France, members of the G7 like Britain, France, and even the US's northern neighbor, Canada, um, can be very meaningful. Now, first of all, of course, we have to recall that these states have announced an intention to recognize Palestinian statehood under certain conditions at the upcoming UN General Assembly session, and have not yet have not yet conducted such recognition. So it may, in the end, not even come about. But more importantly, when you're in, as you suggested, Nassim, when you're in the middle of a genocide, and now also in the midst of a dramatically escalating famine, and you respond to this with a symbolic gesture, while at the same time refusing to take meaningful, concrete actions that address a situation on the ground in which lives are being lost literally by the hour, if not the minute, then I think people are justified in viewing this as kind of a diversion, as kind of a shiny object to divert people's gaze from the policies of these governments that are enabling the genocide and the famine on the ground. I'm talking about things like, continuing arms deliveries to Israel, providing it diplomatic cover, the effective withdrawal of France from the Rome Statute by allowing indicted Israeli war criminals to use its airspace, and so on. So it's a it's a symbolic gesture that is not meaningless, but really only becomes meaningful if and only if accompanied by active, concrete measures that directly address the situation on the ground. All the more so because the states that we're talking about have the capacity, have the power, have the leverage to almost instantaneously change Israeli policy, not only in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank, and effectively have made a choice not to do so.
And these countries are making these gestures, I guess, to prevent what everyone can see is a genocide. And now we've seen footages, well, not now. I mean, there's been so many reports and footages coming out from Gaza, especially one by the ITV. I don't know if you had a chance to see that, Mouin, but it was really, the image was quite horrific. It was something from another world.
Yeah.
And I wanted to basically get your thoughts on a couple of things. First, is the level of destruction. So at the moment, it's the level of destruction in Gaza surpasses combined destruction in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, London, Dresden bombing during the Second World War, Hamburg, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, Sudan. All these wars combined do not have not seen the level of destruction we've seen in Gaza. Over 92% of the homes are destroyed, demolished, razed to the ground. So I guess the only thing that surpasses the destruction is the scale of Israeli violations. And we've seen over the past week a number of interviews. I think one of the most important one was by the American former Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Eguela, who gave an interview with to Tucker Carlson. I don't want to document all the violations Israel is committing. There's a lot there which we can probably get to in another show. Then there was Jonathan Whittle, who wrote an article for The Guardian. He is a UN office, he's the head of office at the UN Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs, which is OCHA.
OCHA.
Yeah. And then he basically documented mass graves, devastation of hospitals, bodies being eaten by dogs, and we've covered a lot of these issues in our previous discussions. And more importantly, I think he mentioned that the ICJ had issued binding provisional measures in March 2024, and despite that, over a year on, Israel is violating every single one of those provisional measures. So, I mean, you can comment on all that, but I think more importantly, I think what I want you to speak to is Hamas, publishing this photo of a hostage with emaciated body. What would be the motivation for that? Of course, to anyone seeing this, the most reasonable conclusion would be to confirm that there is starvation in Gaza, there is devastation in Gaza, and the world must not look away. And Hamas is using the hostage as a way to make that point. However, discussing this may seem, this is the desperate situation which it's trying to present to the world.
No. Well, I want to first just briefly address what you began your question with, which was these images of awesome levels of destruction and devastation taken from a aid flight flying over Gaza City. And of course, the Israelis threatened these journalists that if you take any pictures, we will stop all these flights. In other words, we have something to hide, and it's your responsibility to help us hide it. Some footage emerged anyway, and this is what you're referring to. And then, of course, instantaneously, all of Israel's flunkies come out and say, well, welcome to urban warfare. This is what urban warfare looks like. Well, this is not what urban warfare looks like. And the proof is that, as you yourself just indicated, the level of destruction is orders of magnitude larger than in any of these other recent conflicts. Now, if there had been, street to street, house to house, room to room fighting in every square inch of Gaza City between the Israeli military and Hamas, then perhaps, a case could be made for at least much of this destruction. But what we're dealing here with is not destruction that results from combat. What we're dealing here is a policy of the systematic destruction of all standing structures in the Gaza Strip after Israel has taken control of those areas, and during which Israel is sufficiently confident that there is no military threat to its forces, that it can call in civilian contractors in their D9 bulldozers and begin to knock these structures, apartment buildings, houses, stores, mosques, hospitals, whatever, schools down one after the other, after the other, after the other. So we're talking about a policy of premeditated, systematic destruction that has nothing to do with urban combat. And for all these Israeli flunkies to basically turn around and say, well, this is what urban warfare looks like. No, that's not what it looks like. And here we're not even talking about urban warfare. Now, regarding these images of emaciated Israeli captives, quite clearly, it's an effort at psychological warfare by Hamas, and in my view, directed primarily at Israeli public opinion more than anyone else. And the message it sought to send is basically you think you can starve the Gaza Strip and affect only Palestinians? Well, here's one of your captive soldiers. He's not eating either, and look at how much weight he has lost. It backfired in the sense that the Hasbara Symphony Orchestra, one tap from its conductor, and immediately, simultaneously, in unison, oh, look, Hamas is deliberately starving the hostages to death. You want proof of starvation in Gaza? This is the only proof you have. Well, of course, there's no evidence that Hamas is withholding food from this individual that it has available and is giving to others. It's quite clear, at least to me, that this captive soldier is emaciated because, in contrast to previous videos in which these captives appeared in, they're now rapidly losing weight, not because Hamas has decided to starve its main bargaining chip to death. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. But because the food that is required in the Gaza Strip is no longer available. Are they giving him more than they otherwise would be, or less? Who knows? But the idea that they have decided as a matter of policy to starve this guy, even though they can keep him well fed, I don't know how, I don't know if people are still falling for that, that finally we have proof that there is starvation in Gaza, as if everything else we've seen is, what is it called, Pallywood and Gaza wood and artificial intelligence and so on. But, again, I see it as a propaganda video whose purpose is psychological warfare, and doesn't appear to have succeeded very effectively.
Yeah, and I think people, from what I've seen, generally recognize that of course, there's starvation in Gaza, and the idea that somehow you can um, protect the hostages from starvation seems really odd. It seems that's not something that Hamas can do. So I want to now turn to what's happening in the US and get your thoughts on a number of issues. First, so Trump issued a tweet on his Truth Social where he basically linked well, he was slammed for linking US-Canada trade deal with Israel. So Trump gave the impression that he would introduce punitive measures against Canada for recognizing the Palestinian state. So, sections of his base, condemned Trump for doing that, saying that, why should there be any connection between our trade deal with Canada and what's happening in Palestine? We should do a trade deal with Canada that benefits the American people. So again, there's another fracture there. And the broader crackdown on Palestine and pro-Palestinian activism that's taking place. So last week we saw US imposing sanctions on the PA and the PLO. Just comment on those and why is the US sanctioning? It seems it's against US interest again. The first is on so many issues, America seems to take a position that is always that it always serves Israeli interest and not American interest. And throughout history, if you look at a relationship between allies, you'd see that when allies disagree, the dominant power always has its way over the weaker power. But in the case
You
of
would think.
Israel-Palestine, the weaker power supposedly always seems to call the shots, and everything seems to always go in favor of the weaker power.
Yeah, I mean, America, the movement that claims to be America first is now subordinating the American interest to Israeli priorities, and in this case, basically threatening not only Canada with a worse trade deal, but threatening Americans that they're going to get a worse trade deal than this administration could otherwise have negotiated with Canada because of Israel. There was a lot of criticism, not from Democrats or leftists, but from within the personality cult, from within the MAGA base. And Trump was forced to retract that threat the next day. This would be bizarre under even normal circumstances. But the US is not a normal country, and this is not a normal leadership. The U.S., we have to repeatedly remind ourselves, is governed by a personality cult. Um, uh, it's governed by a movement that claims to subordinate any and every consideration, any and every norm, international norm and value that this state has already accepted, that claims to subordinate every existing treaty and law that the state has already committed to. It will subordinate all that to what it calls America first. And this is what the members of the cult have bought into. That's how Trump got into power. Now he's in power. Um, these people are discovering that actually it's not America first. It's only America first when Israeli interests are not at stake. When Israel comes into the question, it's actually Israel first and America second. And this was so obviously transparent in the Canada case you're mentioning, um, uh, that you had important members of the personality cult rebelling. And Trump was forced to backtrack. On the other issue, this is again a U.S. response to the Franco-Saudi organized conference on a two-state settlement that was held at the United Nations last month. And Trump basically said, as punishment for these states organizing a conference that seeks to implement what has for decades been the international consensus on a resolution of the question of Palestine, and one which the U.S., at least formally, has claimed to be part of for a few years. As punishment for that, the U.S. is now going to refuse visas to any official affiliated with either the PLO or the Palestinian Authority. Now, what we're going to find out very soon is if this only comprises visas that are requested for travel within the United States, or will they also, for example, refuse a visa to Palestinian officials seeking to attend the upcoming session of the General Assembly of the United Nations. And the US did this once before. In 1988, shortly after the establishment or the proclamation of a Palestinian state by the PLO, the General Assembly invited PLO leader Yasser Arafat to come to New York and address the General Assembly. And the Reagan administration denied him a visa. What happened is the General Assembly was so outraged by this violation of the host country agreement. It was such a brazen violation of the US's obligations that it I believe for the first time in its history transferred the General Assembly meeting from New York to Geneva, and the meeting was held there. It seems this is now going to become an increasingly regular occurrence, where if the U.S. doesn't like you, and particularly if the US doesn't like you because Israel doesn't like you, you can't have access to the United Nations. And my own view is that the UN's days in New York are probably numbered. And its leadership, this one is too far gone, but its next leadership should begin seriously examining alternatives to being basically hosted by a personality cult.
Mm. And it wasn't just the members of the PLO and the PA which the Trump administration is seeking to punish; it's its own citizens. So there was
Yes.
another report about the Trump administration seeking to withhold federal funds for states in their preparedness for emergencies, for example. Now, this provision apparently it's been removed because of, I assume, the magnitude, enormity of the opposition and the complaints from his own base, I guess. But it doesn't hide the fact that there are already something like 35 American states who have enacted laws which require what many would say an Israeli loyalty clause. So if you want a contract with the state, you need to express loyalty to Israel, meaning you need to say that you will not boycott Israel, impose or sanction Israel in order to get those contracts. So there is, even if that is that provision which I'm speaking about is removed, it doesn't conceal the fact that American states have already enacted laws
Yes.
which require loyalty tests to Israel.
Precisely. I mean, you can actually call for the destruction of the United States in this America First moment, and you're perfectly fine because that's considered freedom of expression. But if you so much as even think of boycotting the genocidal apartheid regime of Israel, then you're beyond the pale. Imagine if similar laws were passed in the United States, that you can say whatever you want about any state you want, but if you criticize Germany or Laos or Rwanda, you can no longer you are no longer eligible for any federal funding, and certainly not you criticize Paul Kagame, the Rwandan leader, and then you have a hurricane in your state or a flood, you're on your own. The government won't help you. Well, that's exactly what they're doing. You can criticize, but if you criticize Israel, the federal government will cut you loose. You can criticize the U.S., you just can't criticize Israel. It's beyond words.
Mm. Let's end with actually a tweet you issued earlier this week. This is what prompted me to ask this question. I've seen a lot of pro-Israeli influencers on social media focusing on Islamic extremism and how, because of the expansion of Islam, there's been a persecution of Christians and the genocide, what they would call genocide of Christians within the Middle East. And there's this one individual by the name of Gad Saad who's been doing that quite a lot. And to me, it seems like they're trying to shift the narrative to say that no, it's not Israel who is committing genocide against Christians. It's, the expansion of Islam in the Middle East is the main reason why that's happening. So you issued a long tweet rebutting that, and I have my own thoughts on that. I mean, clear example is that Islam did not spread throughout the Middle East and other parts of the region through ethnic cleansing and genocide. That wasn't the way it expanded. Muslims were by and large a minority in the Middle East for nearly 400 years, even though Islam was the dominant religion. For 400 years in the Middle East, they were a minority. And genocide was not really part of the political project. Genocide came about later on as part of, alongside nationalism. With the rise of nationalism, you had the logic of genociding a population kind of came into existence. But anyway, I don't want to really give my thoughts. I want to just simply ask you, why do you think that a narrative is being pushed by so many pro-Israeli guys on social media, and just get your thoughts on your tweet?
Yeah, well, there's been a decades-long campaign of seeking to dehumanize the Palestinians, to prepare them for genocide, if you will. In the 70s and 80s, Israel and its flunkies largely succeeded in making Palestinians synonymous with terrorists, to the extent that even when you had a 14-year-old boy getting shot dead in Nablus for throwing a stone during the first Intifada, that was a terrorist, not the heavily armed soldier that put a bullet through his head. Post 2001, Israel found a new rich vein of prejudice, the Islamophobia that was unleashed in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York and Washington. And particularly also with the rise of Hamas, it has sought to present um, the question of Palestine not as a struggle between Zionism and the Palestinian national movement. It's not a colonial conflict over land, but they have, as they present it, but the Palestinians are basically Muslims, and the reason we have this conflict is because of Islam. It has nothing to do with Zionism. It's nothing to do with Israel. It's nothing to do with the Palestinian people. It's because of Islam, and they present Islam as kind of this living organism, with a mind of its own, that is undifferentiated, as you suggested. Nationalism doesn't exist. None of these other factors exist. There's only Islam. If a Kenyan Muslim, or a Peruvian Muslim or an Algerian Muslim does anything, they're all kind of acting as tentacles of this centralized organism named Islam. It's actually the mirror image of anti-Semitism in the 19th and 20th century, where the Jews were engaged in a coordinated, concerted, premeditated effort to take over the entire world. Well, now it's Islam and the Muslims who are doing exactly the same thing. So, if a Muslim flees Syria, and lands on a Greek island after surviving a journey in a rubber dinghy, has nothing to do with fleeing conflict. It's because Islam is trying to take over the West. And now this particular character you're referring to has been actually one of the most active proponents of this view. And he's Lebanese, was born in Lebanon, lived there until he was 10 years old, and this apparently gives him a unique authority to understand the Middle East and Islam, and he's viewed as a leading authority on the extreme far right in the West. and makes this, crazy argument that's also echoed by a lot of others, that wherever a country has become majority Muslim, that should be seen as colonialism, because it's spread by the sword, and the pre-existing population has been eradicated or has been given a choice between death or conversion. Of course, all complete nonsense, as you yourself just indicated. And this is, of course, contrasted with Zionism transforming Palestine into a Jewish state, which, of course, was a peaceful movement. They did it by throwing flowers at the Palestinians. The Palestinians were all so Islamically anti-Semitic that they refused to live with Jews and left. Had nothing to do, there was no expulsion. It's this complete alternate universe where they concoct this figment of their imagination and try to sell it to the rest of us as reality. And given the growing Islamophobia in the West, there is an attempt to associate the Palestinian struggle for freedom and liberation as part of some kind of Islamic plot to take over the entire world. That's basically what's happening here.
Mm. And I think if people connect the dots carefully, they realize there is now a Islamized version of the protocols of the Elders of Giant. This
Yeah.
plot by Muslims to take over the world, and it's just like it's such a bizarre narrative, which is so deeply racist. But yeah,
But it sells.
it sells, and
Mm.
probably the discussion is for another
Yes.
program altogether. But we've come to the end of our time, Moin, and really enjoyed talking to you as always. So
Likewise.
thank you so much, and thank you also for tuning in. See you next week. Bye bye.